We are looking at a key passage this morning from the second chapter of Acts. It's a passage that Christians either love or feel very uncomfortable about. As one commentator said, Pentecost has become a source of confusion, embarrassment, or division for Christians, even as it has become a curiosity, if not an object of ridicule, for non-Christians. Like the people in verse 12, many of us ask, well, what does this mean? Those who love the passage place a lot of emphasis on the baptism of the Spirit and speaking in tongues. If you haven't received that gift, they maintain, you're a kind of second-class Christian. But this passage isn't talking about speaking in tongues, glossolalia as it's called, that incoherent babbling that some people see as evidence of the presence of the Holy Spirit. Paul in 1 Corinthians 12 and 13 ranks that as one of the childish things that should be put away by mature believers because it leads to disorder and it's easy to fake. What Luke describes here is a very different phenomenon. He pictures each of the disciples speaking intelligibly in a language which was foreign to him. What does this mean? Well, first, let's remember that Luke was not present at Pentecost. He wrote maybe 50 years later. What sources he had, we don't know. All adult eyewitnesses to the event would have been dead by that time. Oral accounts, of course, could have been passed down, but we don't know whom in particular Luke might have talked to or what written sources he had access to. This is the only time in the New Testament or early Christian literature that this sudden ability to speak a foreign language is mentioned. We should note, too, and I think it's very important, that in this passage the Holy Spirit is first a sound like the rush of a mighty wind. There's no actual wind mentioned, just a sound like the wind. But we need to remember, too, that in many languages, in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, really even in English, the word for spirit can be just as well translated wind. There's an interesting parallel to this passage in Plutarch, a Roman writer of the early 2nd century. He says that when a certain famous philosopher came to Rome, the city was filled as if by a rushing mighty wind with the sound of his praises. And if you look at Genesis 1, in some modern translations, where we're accustomed to read, the Spirit of God moved on the face of the waters, you will actually find some modern translations say, a wind from God moved on the face of the waters. As we know, wind can be strong, it can be frightening. Anyone who's been in a storm, or certainly we've seen tornadoes and hurricanes, the wind can be terrifying. But it can also be gentle. And so the equation of spirit and wind is something that is certainly not out of order. We have to remember, too, that the Spirit, the wind, the Spirit, was present at the creation of the world, and it's also here shown as being present at the creation of the church, because that's what this event marks, the origin of the church. Luke tells us that there were people here, God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven, and these people returned to their homes with the news of the gospel, and that's why we find churches spread far and wide. Even by the time Paul begins his missionary journeys, there are churches far beyond the places that Paul ever got to. Let's read this passage now as it appears in the back of your bulletin. Acts 2. When the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our native tongue? Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism, Cretans and Arabs. We hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own tongues. Amazed and perplexed, they ask one another, 'What does this mean?' Some, however, made fun of them and said, "They've had too much wine." Then Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and addressed the crowd. "Fellow Jews and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. And everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved." This is the word of the Lord.